My name is Nora Renner, and on the afternoon of my grandfather's 85th birthday, my sister slid a folder across the picnic table, smiled at the 40 people gathered on the lawn, and said, "Nora, honey, you just need to sign where the tabs are. It's for Grandpa's own good." Inside the folder was an admission contract for the cheapest memory care facility in 3 counties and a listing agreement to put my grandfather's house, the house he built with his own hands, the house he was sitting in front of right then with a paper crown on his head, on the market for $430,000. My sister Whitney had planned the whole party. The balloons, the caterer, the banner that said, "We love you, Gus." She had planned it the way you plan a beautiful funeral for someone who isn't dead yet, because she had already decided he was as good as gone, and she needed the family to watch me sign him away so that later, when he asked where his home went, there would be a room full of people who remembered that I was the one holding the pen. What Whitney did not know, what none of them knew, was that 4 years earlier, when my grandfather could still finish his own sentences, he had taken me to a lawyer's office in town and quietly made me the only person on earth who could make decisions about his health, his money, and his home. Not because I asked. I never asked. He did it because, in his words, I was the one who showed up. So I did not pick up the pen. I picked up the folder, I closed it, and I set it back down in front of my sister, and I said, "No. And let me tell you why none of you can make me. Welcome to this channel where the people everyone treats as the soft one, the simple one, the one who doesn't understand how the real world works, turn out to be holding the only thing that matters." If you have ever been underestimated by your own family because of the work you chose to do, pull up a chair, drop a comment, and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. But to understand what happened on that lawn, you have to understand what I do for a living, because it's the thing my family mocked for 15 years, and it's the exact reason my grandfather trusted me with everything. I am a hospice chaplain. I sit with people who are dying. That's the short version, the one I learned to give at parties so I could watch a person decide, in real time, whether they wanted to keep talking to me. Some people lean in. Most people find somewhere else to be. There is something about the word dying that makes a room rearrange itself, and I stopped taking it personally a long time ago, because I understood that most people have never once sat with it, and I sit with it every day. What I actually do is harder to put on a business card. When someone has weeks or days left, I am the person who comes and is simply there. I don't fix anything. I can't. The fixing is over by the time I arrive. I sit with the dying and the people who love them, and I help them say the things they've been carrying, and sometimes I just hold a hand in a dim room at 2 in the morning so that a frightened person does not have to cross out of this world alone. I have been present for more last breaths than I can count. I know how to make a room calm. I know how to let a silence be long enough. I know that the most important thing you can offer a person at the end is not a solution. It's your presence. It's showing up and not leaving. Let me give you one example so the word doesn't stay abstract. A few years back, I sat with a man named Sal, a retired mechanic, big hands, gruff, dying of something in his lungs that he'd earned over 40 years of work he was proud of. Sal had a son he hadn't spoken to in 11 years. Some old fight, the kind that starts about one thing and calcifies into everything. The son lived 2 states away, and Sal had told everyone, including himself, that he didn't care if he ever saw him again. I'd been sitting with Sal for a couple of weeks by then, in the afternoons, not saying much, the way you don't, and one day near the end he said, into the quiet, not looking at me, "You think a man can be sorry for something and still be too proud to say it." It wasn't really a question, so I asked him if he wanted me to call his son. He didn't answer for a long time. Then he gave me the number off a scrap of paper he'd apparently been carrying in his wallet for 11 years, which told me everything about how much he didn't care. I called the son from the hallway. I told him his father was dying and that there wasn't much time, and I braced for him to hang up because half the time they hang up. He didn't. He drove through the night. He got there at 4 in the morning, and I let him into the room, and I left the 2 of them alone, and I stood in the hallway and listened to 2 stubborn men cry through a closed door and say, finally, 11 years too late and exactly on time, the things they should have said. Sal died the next evening. His son was holding his hand. The last thing that big gruff man did in this world was get his boy back, and he got him back because somebody made a phone call, because somebody was sitting in the room close enough to hear a dying man almost not ask. That is what sitting with people is. It is not nothing. I learned that day, and 100 days like it, a truth I want you to hold on to, because it comes back at the end of this story. The door between estranged people stays open far longer than anyone believes. Right up to the last hour, sometimes past it, my family thought this was a joke, not unkindly at first. When I came back from divinity school and took the chaplaincy job, my mother told her friends I worked at the hospital, and let them assume what they wanted. My sister Whitney, who sells real estate and measures every human being by the square footage they can afford, used to introduce me as my sister, the angel of death, and laugh, and I would laugh too, because that's what you do. You laugh so the table stays comfortable. My brother Eli mostly said nothing, which I would later learn was its own kind of choice. But the line that became the family anthem, the one that got repeated at every holiday until it wore smooth, belonged to Whitney. Whenever the subject of my job came up, whenever someone asked what exactly it was that I did, Whitney would wave her hand and say, "Oh, Nora doesn't really have a job. She just sits with people. She just sits with people." She said it the way you'd describe a child's imaginary friend. Harmless, a little sad. Nothing you'd build a life around, and certainly nothing you'd trust with anything real. For 15 years, that sentence followed me through every family gathering. And for 15 years, I let it, because the people I worked for, the dying and the grieving, knew exactly what sitting with people was worth, and I told myself their knowing was enough. There used to be structural markdown title headings up here before this block. Gus Renner built his house on a ridge outside Caddo Springs, in the Missouri Ozarks, in 1971, board by board, with a well he dug himself and a porch that faced west so he could watch the light go down over the hills every single evening of his life. He raised my father in that house. When my father died, when I was 19 and the bottom fell out of everything, Gus was the one who drove 4 hours to get me, sat with me on that porch in the dark, and did not say a single word for the better part of 2 hours. He just stayed. He let the quiet be long enough. I remember it with a clarity I have for almost nothing else from that year. I had been holding myself together with both hands for days, doing the things you do, the calls, the arrangements, the casseroles from neighbors, the terrible busy work that grief invents to keep you from feeling it. Everyone around me kept talking. They kept telling me he was in a better place. That time would heal it, that I had to be strong, that I needed to eat something. Words and words and words, all of them trying to fix a thing that could not be fixed. All of them, I understand now, mostly trying to make themselves feel better about my pain. And then Gus showed up. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't tell me anything. He drove me out to the ridge and he sat me down in the chair next to his on the porch. And he handed me a cup of coffee I didn't drink, and he sat there with me in the dark while the whole sky turned over above us. And somewhere in the second hour, with no warning, the thing I'd been holding with both hands finally came apart, and I cried the way you can only cry when you stop performing being okay. He didn't reach over. He didn't shush me. He didn't tell me it would be all right. He just stayed in his chair beside me, close enough that I knew he was there, and he let me come apart all the way because he understood, the way it would take me years and a vocation to understand, that a person in real pain does not need you to fix it. They need you to not leave. When it was over, when I was wrung out and quiet, he finally spoke, and all he said was, "There it is. You needed that." And then he played his harmonica, soft and slow, until I fell asleep in the chair, and he put a blanket over me and let me stay. I didn't know it then, but that night on the porch was the first sermon I ever heard about my future vocation, and it didn't have any words in it. My grandfather was not a talker. He was a fixer of small engines and a player of the harmonica, and those two things told you most of what you needed to know about him. He kept an old harmonica in his shirt pocket, a battered Hohner-worn silver where his thumb sat, and on summer evenings he would play the old songs on the porch, slow and a little mournful. The same handful of tunes his own father had taught him. He played the way he loved, quietly and without an audience, and if you wanted in, you had to come sit down and be still and not make it a thing. I spent 1,000 evenings on that porch learning to be still next to him. It is the single most important education I ever received. So when Gus started to slip, I was the one who noticed first, because I was the one who was there. It was small things, at the beginning, the way it always is. He called me by my aunt's name once, then laughed it off. He left the truck running in the driveway for an hour. He told me the same story about a fishing trip 3 times in one afternoon, each time as though it were new, and each time I listened as though it were new, because that is also something I know how to do. I drove out to the ridge more and more. I started staying over. I learned his medications. Then I learned to manage his medications. Then I learned to hide the truck keys in a way that wouldn't shame him. The decline of a person you love is not a cliff. It is a long, gentle, devastating slope, and you walk down it beside them one ordinary day at a time. I want to be honest about what my sister and brother were doing during this stretch, because it matters for everything that came after. Whitney was an hour away, in a 4,000 square foot house she could not quite afford, married to a man named Shane who sold supplements and dabbled in what he called investments, and what the rest of us called losing money confidently. Whitney loved Gus the way you love a painting you intend to inherit. She would post photographs of him on social media on his birthday, captioned with paragraphs about her hero, her rock, the man who taught her everything. She visited maybe 3 times a year, always briefly, always with a camera, always leaving before the part of the visit where he needed help getting to the bathroom, or got confused about what year it was or asked, with terrible, quiet fear in his eyes, whether he was losing his mind. She was never there for that part. The part where you actually sit with it. The part that was, as she so often said, all I was good for. My brother Eli was closer, both in miles and in heart, but Eli had spent his whole life avoiding conflict the way some people avoid heights, and Whitney was a thunderstorm, and so Eli mostly stayed out of the weather. He'd come to the ridge and fix a gutter and leave before any hard conversation could start. I didn't hate him for it. I understood him. But understanding, a thing doesn't mean it doesn't cost you, and his absence cost me plenty in those years. Because it meant I was carrying our grandfather almost entirely alone. And then came the afternoon that changed everything, though it would be 4 years before anyone but Gus and me knew it had. It was a good day. That's the thing people who haven't walked the slope don't understand, that even well into the decline there are good days, hours when the fog lifts and the person you love is entirely, achingly themselves. On this particular afternoon, Gus was sharp as a tack, sitting on the porch with his harmonica in his hand, and out of nowhere he said, "Nora, I want you to drive me into town tomorrow. I made an appointment. Don't tell your sister." The appointment was with a woman named Lillian Adler, an elder law attorney with a small office above the hardware store and the kind of steady, unhurried manner that told you she had sat with a lot of hard things herself. Gus had called her himself, weeks before, on one of his clear days. He had been planning this. I sat in the waiting room because he asked me to at first. Then Lillian came out and said he wanted me in the room, and what happened over the next hour rearranged my understanding of my grandfather entirely. He had thought about all of it. He knew what was coming. He had watched his own brother disappear into the same fog years before, and he had watched that brother's children fight over his body and his money like dogs over a bone, and he was determined that it would not happen to him. So, with Lillian guiding him through it in plain language, he put the pieces in place. He signed a durable power of attorney, naming me as his agent for every financial decision he would no longer be able to make. He signed a healthcare directive, naming me as the person who would speak for his body and his care when he no longer could, and spelling out, in his own blunt words that Lillian wrote down exactly as he said them, what he wanted. He wanted to die in his house, on his ridge, looking west. He did not want to be moved to a facility, to be parked and forgotten. That was the phrase, "I'll never lose it." And then he did the thing that would matter most of all. He moved his house and his land and his savings into a living trust, with himself as the trustee while he was able, and me as the successor trustee, the moment 2 doctors agreed he no longer was. I remember sitting there with my hands in my lap, overwhelmed, telling him he didn't have to do this, that we could figure it out as a family, that Whitney and Eli should be part of it. And my grandfather looked at me with one of his last truly clear gazes, and he said something I have repeated to myself 100 times since. He said, "Family's not who shares your blood, Nora. It's who shows up. You're the one who shows up, so you're the one who decides." Then he asked Lillian for a copy of everything, and he had me drive him home, and on the porch that evening he took the harmonica out of his pocket and played the old songs while the light went down, and he never once mentioned the lawyer's office again. The fog rolled back in over the following months, the way it does. But the papers were signed. They sat in a fireproof box in Lillian Adler's office, and a copy sat in mine. And for 4 years nobody needed them, and I almost let myself forget they existed. If you have ever been the one who shows up, the one who does the unglamorous work of love, while other people perform it from a distance, I need you to hear what my grandfather understood. Showing up is not nothing. Showing up is the whole thing. Subscribe if you believe that, because I am about to tell you what happened when the people who never showed up decided it was time to cash in, and how a quiet man's foresight became the only wall between my grandfather and the cheapest bed in the county. By the spring of his 85th year, my grandfather had crossed a line that doesn't get uncrossed. He no longer knew what year it was. He knew me on most days, though not all, and the days he looked at me with no recognition were the hardest days of my life, harder than burying my father, because my father at least had gone all at once. Gus was leaving in pieces, and I was there for every piece. I had moved into the Ridge house by then. I had cut my chaplaincy hours back to part-time. I had a home health aide named Marisol coming in 4 days a week. A sturdy, warm, unflappable woman who had cared for more dying elders than even I had, and who loved my grandfather with the fierce practical tenderness of someone who has decided a stranger is hers now. Between the 2 of us, we kept him home. We kept him safe. We kept him on his porch in his chair facing west. I'll tell you what keeping him home actually looked like, because it's easy to say and hard to live, and because it's the part my sister never saw. There was a night that spring, maybe 3 in the morning, when I woke to a sound from his room and found him standing in the dark beside his bed, fully dressed in the clothes he'd worn the day before, terrified, because he did not know where he was and he did not know who I was. He looked at me with the eyes of a frightened child in an old man's face and he said, "I want to go home, please. I just want to go home." He was standing in the living room of the house he had built with his own hands, the house he had lived in for 50 years, and he wanted to go home, and there was no home I could take him to, because the home he meant was a place in time, not in space, and that place was gone. You cannot argue with that fear. I learned early that you do not correct it. You do not say you are home, Grandpa. This is your house, because to a mind in that fog the facts are an attack, and the facts make it worse. So I did the only thing that works, the thing my whole vocation is built on. I stopped needing him to be anywhere but where he was. I took his hand and I said, "I know, I'll take you. But it's late and it's a long way, so let's sit a while first and rest and we'll go when it's light." And I walked him slowly to his chair and I put a blanket over his knees and I sat down beside him in the dark and I started to hum one of the old tunes, the ones he'd played on the porch my whole life. He went still. Somewhere under the terror, the song reached a part of him the disease hadn't taken, and his breathing slowed. And after a while, his thumb found the worn silver spot on the harmonica in his shirt pocket, and he rubbed it, and the fear drained slowly out of his face. We sat there until the light came up over the ridge, the two of us, and by the time it did he had forgotten he wanted to leave, and he ate his breakfast, and it was a good morning. That happened more nights than I can count. Nobody photographed it. Nobody posted a tribute about it. It was just the work, the unglamorous 3 a.m. work of loving someone all the way down the slope. And I did it because somebody had to, and because he was mine, and because he had once sat with me in the dark and not left. It was not easy and it was not cheap, but the trust covered his care, and I managed it carefully, the way he'd trusted me to, and we were making it work. He was failing, but he was failing at home, which was the one thing he had asked for. I thought we had an understanding, the family and I was wrong. What we had was a silence that I mistook for peace, and underneath that silence my sister had been doing math. I find out the way you always find out, sideways and too late. It was Eli who let it slip, though he didn't mean to. He came out to the ridge one afternoon to fix the porch step, which was the kind of thing Eli did instead of talking. And while he was crouched over the riser with a screwdriver, he said, not looking at me, "So you're really not gonna go for the Cedarview thing?" I said, "What's Cedarview?" And my brother went very still, and I watched him realize that I didn't know, and that he had just stepped in the middle of something Whitney had told him to leave alone. It came out in pieces, the way these things do when someone is trying to take back what they've already said. Cedarview was a memory care facility 2 counties over. The cheapest one. Whitney had toured it. Whitney had a plan, and the plan was this: move Gus to Cedarview, where Medicaid would eventually cover the bed, once they spent down his assets, and sell the Ridge house and the 80 acres around it for $430,000, and split the proceeds 3 ways while there was still money to split instead of letting it all, as Whitney apparently put it, evaporate on home aides and a house nobody's going to want to deal with later. "She says it's the responsible thing," Eli said, still not looking at me. "She says you're too close to it, too emotional, that you're letting him stay home because you can't let go, and it's costing everybody." I stood on my grandfather's porch and I looked out at the hills going gold in the late light, and I felt something settle in me that was not rage. I want to be precise about this, because I think people expect rage, and rage is actually the easy thing. What I felt was clarity. The cold, clean clarity I feel in a dying person's room when all the noise falls away, and there is only what matters and what doesn't. What mattered was that my grandfather had told me, in writing, in his own words, that he wanted to die in this house, on his ridge, looking west. He did not want to be moved to a facility, to be parked and forgotten. That was the phrase, "I'll never lose it." And then he did the thing that would matter most of all. He moved his house and his land and his savings into a living trust, with himself as the trustee while he was able, and me as the successor trustee, the moment 2 doctors agreed he no longer was. I remember sitting there with my hands in my lap, overwhelmed, telling him he didn't have to do this, that we could figure it out as a family, that Whitney and Eli should be part of it. And my grandfather looked at me with one of his last truly clear gazes, and he said something I have repeated to myself 100 times since. He said, "Family's not who shares your blood, Nora. It's who shows up. You're the one who shows up, so you're the one who decides." Then he asked Lillian for a copy of everything, and he had me drive him home, and on the porch that evening he took the harmonica out of his pocket and played the old songs while the light went down, and he never once mentioned the lawyer's office again. The fog rolled back in over the following months, the way it does. But the papers were signed. They sat in a fireproof box in Lillian Adler's office, and a copy sat in mine. And for 4 years nobody needed them, and I almost let myself forget they existed. If you have ever been the one who shows up, the one who does the unglamorous work of love, while other people perform it from a distance, I need you to hear what my grandfather understood. Showing up is not nothing. Showing up is the whole thing. Subscribe if you believe that, because I am about to tell you what happened when the people who never showed up decided it was time to cash in, and how a quiet man's foresight became the only wall between my grandfather and the cheapest bed in the county. Whitney had rented a tent. I want you to understand the scale of the performance. She had rented a white event tent and set it up on the lawn below my grandfather's porch, with round tables and white cloths and a caterer and a balloon arch and a banner, hand-lettered, that read "We love you, Gus" in cheerful blue. There were close to 40 people there. Cousins I hadn't seen in years, neighbors from down the ridge, members of the church Gus had stopped being able to attend. Whitney had invited all of them, because Whitney understood, the way she understood everything, that an audience changes what a family is willing to do. You will sign a man's home away in front of 40 witnesses if the whole thing is dressed up as love. That was the bet. She had even put a paper birthday crown on my grandfather's head. He sat in his wheelchair at the head of the main table, in the shade, a little lost, his hands working slowly in his lap. Someone had dressed him in a good shirt. He had his harmonica, because I had made sure of it, tucked into the pocket the way it had been for 60 years, and every so often his thumb found the worn silver spot and rubbed it, and a flicker of something like peace would cross his face. He did not fully understand where he was, but he knew the shape of the hills, and he was facing west because I had positioned his chair myself, and small mercies are still mercies. Whitney worked the crowd like the professional she was. She was radiant. She hugged the cousins and dabbing at her eyes, telling the neighbors how hard this season had been on all of us. And she shot me looks across the lawn, warm public looks with cold private cores that said, "Be good. Don't make a scene. Sign where the tabs are." Shane stood near the drinks table telling a cousin about an investment opportunity. Eli stood at the edge of it all looking like a man at his own sentencing, catching my eye and looking away, catching it and looking away. And there was one guest Whitney didn't recognize, a composed silver-haired woman in a well-cut blazer, sitting quietly at the end of a side table with a leather folio in front of her, declining the wine, watching everything. Whitney came over to her at one point, all hostess warmth, and asked how she knew the family, and Lillian Adler smiled and said, "I'm a friend of Gus's from town. He invited me a while back, I wouldn't have missed it," which was true, every word, and told Whitney nothing, and Whitney moved on, and I watched my sister walk right past the entire architecture of her own undoing and never feel the draft. After the cake, Whitney tapped her glass. She gave a speech. Of course she gave a speech. She stood at the front of the tent with the hills behind her and my grandfather in his paper crown beside her, and she talked about what a remarkable man Gus Renner was, how he had built this home with his bare hands, how he had taught us all the meaning of family. She got the crowd misty. She was, I'll give her this, very good, the kind of speaker who can fill a whole room and leave no air in it for the truth. And then she pivoted, smooth as anything, into the part she'd actually come to deliver. "As many of you know," she said, "this past year has been so hard. Watching the strongest man we know need more and more care. And as a family, we've had to make some really difficult, really grown-up decisions about what's best for Grandpa. About making sure he's somewhere safe, with round-the-clock professional care, instead of, isolated out here where anything could happen." A soft murmur of sympathy. She let it build. "So today, surrounded by everyone who loves him, we're going to take the first step toward getting Grandpa the care he deserves. And I'm so grateful we can do it together as a family." She turned and looked at me and she smiled, and she picked up the folder from her table and carried it to me across the tent in front of everyone, and she set it down, and she put a pen on top of it, and she said, gently, lovingly for the audience, "Nora, as his closest caregiver, it's only right that you do the honors. Just sign where the tabs are, honey." 40 faces turned to me. I felt the whole weight of the performance settle on my shoulders, the assumption baked into every smiling face that I was the soft one, the simple one, the one who sits with people and holds their hands and does what she's told. Whitney stood over me glowing with the certainty of a woman who had already won. I looked at the folder. I looked at my grandfather in his paper crown, his thumb moving on the silver of the harmonica. And I stood up slowly so that I was not looking up at my sister but level with her, and I picked up the folder and I closed it, and I set it back down on the table. "No," I said, not loudly. Just clearly, the way you say the one true thing in a room full of noise. "I'm not going to sign this, and before this goes any further, everyone here deserves to know what's actually in that folder and what's actually going on." Whitney's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. "Nora," she said, a warning wrapped in sugar, "this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," I said. "You picked it, 40 witnesses, let's use them." I turned to the tent. My voice did not shake. I have stood in too many rooms where the worst thing in the world was happening and someone needed to be the calm one. I knew how to do this. "That folder," I said, "contains 2 things. The first is an admission contract for Cedarview, which is the cheapest memory care facility in the region, 2 counties away from here, where my grandfather doesn't know a soul. The second is a listing agreement to sell this house. His house, the one he built for $430,000. The plan, which my sister has been arranging for months, is to move Grandpa to Cedarview, sell the ridge and the land out from under him, and split the money 3 ways before, and I'm quoting her, "It all evaporates on keeping him home." The murmur in the tent changed temperature. Whitney stepped in fast. "That is not fair. That is a gross oversimplification of a responsible financial decision. She is too emotionally involved too." "My grandfather," I said over her, still calm, "does not want to go to a facility. He told me so himself 4 years ago, when he could still tell me things clearly. He told me he wants to die in this house, on this ridge, looking west. He was very specific. And he didn't just tell me, he put it in writing." I reached into my bag and took out the folder. My folder, the fireproof one. "4 years ago," I said. "Before any of this, my grandfather went to an attorney, on his own, on one of his clear days, and he made some decisions about his own future, because he had watched his brother's family tear each other apart, and he was determined that it would not happen here. He signed a durable power of attorney, naming me as his agent for financial decisions. He signed a healthcare directive, naming me to make his medical decisions, and stating, in his own words, that he wants to remain in his home. And he placed this house, this land, and his savings into a living trust." I looked at my sister. "Whitney, you cannot sell this house. It isn't Grandpa's to sell anymore, not as an individual, and it was never yours. It belongs to the trust. And the trust says that when 2 doctors agree that Grandpa can no longer manage his own affairs, control passes to the successor trustee." I paused. "That happened this week. 2 of his physicians signed the letters. As of this week, the only person with the legal authority to sell this house, or to move him anywhere, is the successor trustee." Whitney's voice had gone thin. "And who is that supposed to be?" "It's me," I said. "It was always me. He chose me 4 years ago. You just never asked him because you were never here to ask." The tent had gone completely silent. Even the kids had stopped. Whitney stood in the middle of all those witnesses she had so carefully gathered, and I watched the performance fail in real time, watched her reach for the family anthem one more time because it was the only tool she had ever needed. "This is insane," she said, turning to the crowd, her voice climbing. "She's making this up, or she manipulated him into signing something when he was already confused. She's been alone with him this whole time. Who knows what she got him to sign? She sits with dying people for a living, for God's sake. She probably does this all the time. She just—" "Mrs. Doyle." The voice came from the side table. Calm, clear, carrying. Lillian Adler stood up, the leather folio in her hands, and every head in the tent turned to her, because she had the unmistakable steadiness of a person who knows precisely what she's talking about. "My name is Lillian Adler," she said. "I'm an elder law attorney in Caddo Springs. I'm the friend of Gus's you spoke with earlier." A faint, dry smile. 4 years ago, your grandfather walked into my office, by himself, having made the appointment himself, on a day when he was entirely lucid, and asked me to help him plan for exactly the situation your family is in right now. I drafted every document Nora just described. I watched your grandfather sign them, of sound mind, with 2 independent witnesses and a notary present, specifically so that no one could ever claim he was confused or coerced. He was neither. He was one of the most clear-headed clients I have ever had, precisely because he had already seen where this road goes. She let that sit. "Everything Nora has told you is accurate," Lillian said. "She is your grandfather's healthcare agent, his financial power of attorney, and as of this week, with 2 physicians' certification of his incapacity, the sole trustee of his trust. She has complete legal authority over his care and his property. No one at this table can move him or sell this house. That decision is hers alone, and your grandfather's documented wish, in his own words, is to remain in this home." She looked at Whitney, not unkindly. "I'd think very carefully, Mrs. Doyle, before suggesting in front of all these people that the documents were forged. They weren't, and I'd be the one testifying." Whitney opened her mouth and closed it. For the first time in my life, I watched my sister have nothing to say. And then another voice spoke up from the edge of the tent, rough and quiet and shaking a little. "She's telling the truth." It was Marisol. She stepped forward, my grandfather's aide, this sturdy, unflappable woman, and she was not unflappable now. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady in the way that matters. "I have worked in this house for 2 years, Marisol said. 4 days a week. I want to tell all of you something because you are all sitting here at this beautiful party, and most of you I have never seen before, not once, not at this house." She looked around the tent slowly. "You want to know who takes care of Gus? Nora takes care of Gus. She moved in. She gave up half her work. She gets up at 3 in the morning when he is frightened, and she sits with him until he is not frightened anymore. She holds his hand when he does not know his own name. She has never once complained, not to me, not where he could hear. I have cared for many old people at the end. I have never seen anyone love one the way she loves that man. Her voice cracked. She does not sit with people because it is easy. She sits with people because almost nobody else will. And you, she looked at Whitney, you rented a tent. Nobody moved. And then into that enormous silence came a small, thin, broken thread of sound. It was my grandfather, in his wheelchair in his paper crown, facing west. He had gotten the harmonica out of his pocket somehow, with his slow, uncertain hands, and he had lifted it to his mouth, and he was playing. Not well. A few wavering notes, breathy and cracked, the muscle memory of 60 years reaching up through the fog. But I knew the tune. It was one of the old ones, one of the songs his father taught him, the one he'd played on that porch the night he came to get me when my own father died. He didn't know what had just happened in the tent. I don't think he understood any of it, but somewhere underneath, in the part of him that the disease hadn't reached yet, the part that knows a song when the name of your own daughter is gone, he had felt the room turn warm and safe again, and he had reached for his harmonica the way he always did when things were right, and he was playing his home back into the air. I went and knelt beside his chair, and I put my hand over his hand on the harmonica, and the whole tent watched a dying man play a few broken bars of a song on his 85th birthday in the home that was, because of his own quiet wisdom, going to stay his until the end. Whitney left before the song was over. Shane followed her. I heard the car doors and the gravel, and then they were gone, and the music kept going, thin and certain, out over the hills. I'd be lying if I told you the whole family rushed to my side in a wave of vindication, because that's not how these afternoons actually end. Mostly people were stunned and a little embarrassed and unsure what to do, the way people always are when a performance they came to clap for turns into something true and uncomfortable in front of them. The party broke up quietly. The caterer packed the cake. The cousins hugged me on the way out with a new and slightly frightened respect, the way you hug someone you have just badly underestimated. But one person stayed. Eli helped me get Grandpa back up to the porch as the sun went down. He didn't say anything while we did it. The careful work of moving a frail man from a wheelchair to his good chair, the work he had mostly left to me for years. We got Gus settled, facing west, with a blanket over his knees and the harmonica back in his pocket, and the light started its long, slow fall over the hills, and Eli stood at the porch rail with his back to me for a long time. When he finally turned around, my brother was crying. I knew, he said. Not the documents. I didn't know about those, but I knew it was wrong, Nora. I knew what Whitney was doing was wrong, and I told myself it was responsible. I told myself you were too close to it because that was easier than standing up to her. Easier than driving out here. Easier than... He stopped. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, an Eli gesture, a fixing the gutter gesture, a man more comfortable with his hands than his heart. You've been doing this alone for years, while I fixed porch steps and left. While Whitney took pictures, you were the one who showed up. You're here now, I said. I want to be here now. He looked at Grandpa at the back of that white head in the paper crown nobody'd had the heart to take off. Teach me how to sit with him. I don't know how. You do teach me. And that, of everything that happened that day, is the part I hold on to. Because here is a thing I know from 100 bedsides that I had somehow never applied to my own family. It is almost never too late for a person to start showing up. The whole of my work is built on that truth. People make peace in the last hour. People say the thing at the very end. The door stays open longer than you'd ever believe. My brother walked through it on that porch at the rail with the light going down, and I was not going to be the one to close it on him. So I taught him. That evening was the first lesson. We sat, the three of us, and we didn't talk much, and we let the quiet be long enough, and Grandpa played a few more broken notes, and Eli learned the first and hardest thing about sitting with someone you're losing, which is that you don't have to do anything at all. You just have to stay. My grandfather lived another 14 months. He lived them in his house on his ridge facing west. He never went to Cedar View. He never spent a night anywhere but the home he built with his own hands, which is exactly, precisely, in his own written words, what he wanted. The trust covered his care to the end. Marisol stayed with us the whole way, and she was there, with me and with Eli on the last night in the dim room at the end when it was time. Eli came every week, and then every few days, and then near the end he was there as much as I was. My brother turned out to be good at it, the sitting, once he stopped being afraid of it. He held Grandpa's hand at 3 a.m. more than once. He learned the songs. The thing Whitney spent 15 years mocking, the thing she tried to use as a weapon, the simple, unglamorous work of being present for another human being, my brother learned it at our grandfather's side, and it changed him. The way it changes everyone who finally sits down and stops running. There was one evening, a few months before the end, that I keep folded up and carry with me. It was one of those dusk hours when the fog pulled back, rarer by then, more precious. Gus was in his chair, facing west, and Eli and I were on either side of him, and the light was doing its slow gold fall over the hills. And Grandpa was clear. He looked at the two of us, one and then the other, and he smiled, the old Gus smile, the one I hadn't seen in a long time, and he said, "Both my kids came." He thought we were his children, not his grandchildren. It didn't matter. He had us mixed up in time, but he had the important thing exactly right, which was that the people who loved him were there, on the porch, in the good spot, and nobody was leaving. Then he asked Eli to hand him the harmonica, and he played, and that evening the song came out almost whole, steadier than it had any right to be, as if he'd been saving it. Eli wept openly and didn't try to hide it. I will spend the rest of my life grateful that my brother was there for that he didn't miss it, that he walked back through the door while it was still open. The first night Eli stayed alone with Grandpa, so I could sleep a full night for the first time in months. He called me at 2 in the morning, not because anything was wrong, but because Gus had woken frightened and wanted to go home, and Eli didn't know what to do. I told him what I'd learned. Don't argue with the fear. Don't correct him. Just take his hand and tell him you'll take him home, but it's late, so sit a while first. And hum him one of the old songs. I stayed on the phone and listened to my brother, this man who had spent his whole life fixing gutters instead of facing hard things, sit down in the dark beside a frightened old man and hum a tune until the fear went out of him. When it was quiet, Eli came back to the phone, and his voice was different, cracked open, and he said, "He's asleep. Nora, how did you do this alone for so long?" And I said, "You're not asking me that anymore, you're here?" And he was. Whitney did not come back. She and Shane sent a card when Gus passed, signed in Shane's handwriting. I heard later, through the cousin grapevine, that the two of them split up the following year, that the investments and the 4,000-square-foot house finally came due. I take no pleasure in that. I sat with too many people at the end of their lives, people full of regret over money they chased and family they lost, to feel anything but a kind of sadness for my sister, who never once understood that the inheritance she was fighting over was never the house. It was him. It was the evenings on the porch. It was the chance to sit down beside a good man and be still while there was still time, and she sold that chance for a tent and a banner, and now it's gone, and no amount of square footage will buy it back. I have the harmonica now, the battered Hohner, worn silver where his thumb sat for 60 years. I keep it in my own pocket some days, when I go to sit with someone who is dying, and sometimes, if the room is right and the family says yes, I play a few bars of one of the old songs, the ones his father taught him, the ones he taught me without ever calling it teaching. I'm not good at it. He never cared whether you were good at it. He cared whether you showed up and were still and let the quiet be long enough. That was the whole inheritance. It turned out to be everything. If there's one thing I want you to take from my grandfather's story, it's this. The world is full of people who will tell you that the work of showing up is not real work. That sitting with people, caring for people, being present for the parts of life that can't be photographed or monetized or posted, is soft, simple, unimportant, something for the people who couldn't do anything that matters. They are wrong. They are so completely wrong that they will not even understand what they've lost until it is too late to get it back. My grandfather understood. He spent his whole quiet life paying attention to who actually showed up, and at the end, when it counted, he put everything he had into the hands of the one grandchild who did, not the one who performed love from a distance. The one who was there at 3 in the morning. He knew the difference. He had always known the difference. And because he knew it, he died at home, in his chair, facing the hills, exactly as he wanted, with his harmonica in his pocket and people who loved him in the room. Be the one who shows up. And if you haven't been, it is almost never too late to start. My brother is proof of that. The door stays open longer than you think. That's my story. A quiet man, a ridge house facing west, and a folder of papers that turned out to be the strongest kind of love there is, the kind that thinks ahead, the kind that protects you when you can no longer protect yourself. If this reached something in you, tell me in the comments about the person in your life who showed up when it counted, or the one you want to start showing up for. I read every one. And if you believe that being present for each other is the realest work there is, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.